The meeting was supposed to be straightforward. A formality, really. Russia's President Vladimir Putin had extended a personal invitation to Captain Ibrahim Traoré, and when Putin invited someone to Moscow, there was usually only one acceptable response: gratitude and alignment. For decades, the formula had worked flawlessly. African leaders arrived in the Kremlin seeking support, military equipment, economic investment, political backing. Putin offered it generously, along with something the West often withheld: lack of judgment about how power was exercised domestically. No lectures about democracy, no conditions about human rights. Just partnership, Russian style. And in exchange, those leaders understood the implicit bargain. When Russia needed votes in the UN, they voted with Moscow. When Russia needed access to resources or strategic locations, doors opened. When Russia needed allies to counter Western influence, African partners stood ready. It was a transaction both sides understood. But Ibrahim Traoré hadn't come to Moscow to make that deal. And by the end of this meeting, Putin would realize he was facing something he rarely encountered: someone who genuinely didn't need what Russia was offering badly enough to surrender independence for it. This is the story of what happens when a master strategist meets someone who refuses to be a piece on anyone's chessboard. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks after Traoré's confrontation with Macron in Paris. The timing wasn't coincidental. Russia had watched that viral moment with great interest. Here was an African leader publicly challenging French neocolonialism, rejecting Western paternalism, demanding genuine sovereignty. Exactly the kind of leader Russia wanted in its orbit. Putin's calculus was simple: Traoré had burned bridges with France. He would need new partners. Russia could offer military support the French no longer would. Economic investment without the colonial baggage. A relationship based on mutual interest rather than historical guilt. And in return, Russia would gain influence in West Africa, access to Burkina Faso's natural resources, and another vote against Western interests in international forums. It seemed like a natural alignment. But Putin had misread the situation. Traoré hadn't confronted Macron because he wanted a new master. He'd done it because he didn't want any master at all. When Traoré's plane landed in Moscow in December 2023, the reception was carefully choreographed to impress. Honor guard, red carpet, Russian officials treating the young African captain like a head of state, not a military leader of a small, poor nation. The message was clear: Russia sees you as important. Russia respects you. Russia can be the partner you need. Traoré accepted the honors with polite professionalism. But his team noticed something. He didn't seem impressed. Didn't seem grateful in the way Moscow expected. He was courteous but unmoved. The meeting took place in Putin's private office in the Kremlin. No large delegations. No cameras. Just Putin, Traoré, and a handful of key advisors on each side. Putin sat behind his famously oversized desk. A piece of furniture designed to emphasize power and create psychological distance. Traoré sat across from him in a chair positioned slightly lower, another subtle power dynamic built into the room's architecture. But if Traoré noticed these details, he gave no indication. He sat with perfect military posture, hands folded, expression calm. Putin opened with warmth. "Captain Traoré, welcome to Moscow. I've been following your work with great interest. What you said in Paris about sovereignty, about African independence, it resonated strongly with us. Russia has always supported nations seeking to chart their own course free from Western domination." "Thank you, President Putin," Traoré replied neutrally. "Russia and Africa have a long history of partnership. During your independence struggles, the Soviet Union stood with you when the West supported colonial powers. We provided education, military training, support. We asked for nothing in return except friendship." It was the standard opening. Remind the African leader of historical ties. Position Russia as the anti-colonial alternative to the West. Establish moral authority. "That history is appreciated," Traoré said. But he didn't elaborate. Didn't offer the effusive gratitude Putin was accustomed to hearing. Putin continued. Today, Russia is prepared to deepen that partnership. Burkina Faso faces security challenges. Terrorism. Instability. We can provide military equipment, training, intelligence support. The kind of support France failed to provide effectively. And in exchange? Traoré asked directly. Putin smiled slightly. Direct. He could work with direct. Partnership. Cooperation on issues of mutual interest. Russia doesn't impose conditions the way the West does. We don't lecture about democracy or human rights. We respect sovereignty. Except when that sovereignty conflicts with Russian interests, Traoré said quietly. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Putin's smile remained, but his eyes hardened slightly. I'm not sure I understand your meaning. President Putin, Russia has intervened militarily in Georgia, Ukraine, Syria. In each case, sovereignty was subordinated to Russian strategic interests. So when you say Russia respects sovereignty, you mean Russia respects sovereignty that aligns with Russian goals. It was a direct challenge. The kind of thing people simply didn't say to Putin's face. Not in the Kremlin. Not anywhere. Putin's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, shifted in his seat, preparing to intervene. But Putin raised a hand slightly, signaling him to wait. Captain, you're conflating different situations. Ukraine was a matter of protecting Russian-speaking populations. Syria was at President Assad's invitation. These were complex geopolitical circumstances. They were assertions of Russian power, Traoré said, his tone remaining respectful but firm. Which is your right as a major power? I'm not criticizing Russia's foreign policy. I'm simply noting that Russia, like every major power, pursues its interests. And when smaller nations' sovereignty conflicts with those interests, sovereignty becomes negotiable. Putin leaned back in his chair, studying Traoré carefully. You speak very boldly for someone seeking partnership. I'm not seeking partnership, President Putin. You invited me here. And before we discuss any cooperation, I think it's important we're honest about what partnership with Russia actually means. And what does it mean, in your view? It means military support in exchange for political alignment. Economic investment in exchange for resource access. Diplomatic backing in exchange for UN votes. It's a transaction. Which is fine, all international relations are transactional to some degree. But let's not pretend it's something else. Putin was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something surprising. You're right. Everyone in the room looked at him. You're right, Putin repeated. It is transactional. Every partnership is. But here's what makes Russia different from the West, we're honest about it. We don't dress up national interest in the language of human rights and democracy. We don't pretend we're helping you for altruistic reasons. We have interests. You have interests. We find where they align. That's the relationship. Fair enough, Traoré said. So let me be equally honest about Burkina Faso's interests. He pulled out a single sheet of paper. We need military equipment. That's true. We face genuine security threats. But we need equipment that comes with training, technology transfer, and no strings attached to our foreign policy. We need economic investment. Also true. But we need investment in productive capacity. Agriculture, manufacturing, infrastructure, not just resource extraction that benefits foreign companies. We need diplomatic support. But we need support for our sovereignty, not support contingent on us supporting Russian positions we may not agree with. Putin listened without interrupting. And most importantly, Traoré continued, we need partners who understand that Burkina Faso's independence is not negotiable. Not for money. Not for weapons. Not for diplomatic cover. We will work with Russia where our interests align. But we will not become a Russian client state. No one is asking you to become a client state, Putin said. Aren't you? Because every partnership Russia offers African nations comes with an implicit understanding. Support us internationally. Give us access to your resources. Allow our military presence when we request it. And in exchange, we don't criticize how you govern. That's the deal, isn't it? Putin's expression was unreadable. You're describing cooperation between sovereign nations. I'm describing subordination with better marketing. And I'm telling you we're not interested. The tension in the room was palpable. Putin's advisors looked shocked. No one spoke to the Russian president this way. Lavrov tried again to intervene. Captain Traoré, perhaps you misunderstand. I understand perfectly, Minister Lavrov. Russia sees Africa as a theater for great power competition. You want to counter Western influence. Expand Russian presence. Secure access to resources. And you're willing to offer better terms than the West to achieve that. But at the end of the day, we're still pawns in someone else's game. And I'm here to tell you we're not interested in being pawns. Not for the West. Not for Russia. Not for China. Not for anyone. Putin stood, walking to the window overlooking the Kremlin grounds. He was quiet for almost a minute. Then he turned back to Traoré. Captain, I'm going to be more direct than I usually am in diplomatic settings. You're making a mistake. Burkina Faso is a small, poor country facing serious threats. You need external support. That's reality, not insult. And there are only so many sources of that support in the world. Russia can provide what you need. But partnership requires reciprocity. You can't take Russian weapons, Russian investment, Russian diplomatic backing and then refuse to support Russian interests. That's not partnership. That's exploitation. We're offering you a good deal. Better than what the West offers. Better than what China offers. We're offering respect, support, and minimal interference in your domestic affairs. What more do you want? Traoré stood as well, meeting Putin's gaze directly. I want what you take for granted, President Putin. The ability to make decisions based solely on Burkina Faso's interests. You don't check with Washington or Beijing before deciding Russian policy. You don't accept conditions from other powers on your sovereignty. You pursue Russian interests, and other nations have to accept that or oppose it. That's what real sovereignty looks like. And that's what I want for Burkina Faso. You're not Russia, Putin said flatly. We have nuclear weapons. A permanent Security Council seat. An economy built over centuries. You can't compare. I'm not comparing our power. I'm comparing our right to sovereignty. And that right doesn't depend on military strength or economic size. It's inherent. Either nations are sovereign or they're not. Either we have the right to make our own decisions or we don't. And I refuse to accept that Burkina Faso's poverty means we must surrender that right. Putin returned to his desk, sitting down. He looked at Traoré with something that might have been grudging respect. You're idealistic. Admirably so. But idealism doesn't defeat terrorists or build economies. No, Traoré agreed. But it does establish the framework within which we pursue those goals. We will defeat terrorism. We will build our economy. And we will do it in ways that preserve our sovereignty, even if that makes the process harder and longer. Putin tapped his fingers on the desk, thinking. Let me propose something different. Russia provides military equipment and training. No conditions on your foreign policy. You vote your conscience in the UN. We invest in genuine development projects, agriculture, infrastructure. Technology transfer included. We compete fairly for resource contracts. No preferential access. And we establish a partnership based on genuine mutual respect. Would that interest you? It was more than Traoré had expected. A significant departure from Russia's standard approach. Why would you offer that? Traoré asked. Because I recognize something in you that I haven't seen in many African leaders. You're not posturing. You're not angling for better terms. You genuinely mean what you say about sovereignty. And frankly, that's rare. Rare enough that I'm willing to experiment with a different kind of relationship. And if other African nations see this and demand the same terms? Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But I suspect most leaders aren't like you. Most will accept the standard arrangement because it's easier and more immediately profitable. You're an exception. Maybe we should treat you as one. Traoré considered this carefully. I'll agree to those terms. But with one addition. Which is? This partnership is public. Fully transparent. Other African nations need to see that it's possible to work with Russia without surrendering sovereignty. We publish the agreements. We're honest about terms. We demonstrate that genuine partnership is possible. Putin smiled, this time with genuine amusement. You want to use our relationship as a template to pressure other powers into offering better terms to Africa. Yes. That's actually clever. You're playing us against each other without becoming dependent on any of us. That's the idea. Putin laughed, a real laugh, not the calculated political chuckle. Captain Traoré, you're either the smartest person I've met in African politics or the most naive. I haven't decided which. But I find I like you. You have spine. And you're honest, which in my business is so rare it's almost exotic. So we have a deal? We have a deal. But understand something, Captain. This only works if you deliver. If Burkina Faso becomes unstable, if you fail to build what you're trying to build, the world will see this as proof that your approach doesn't work. That rejecting traditional partnerships leads to failure. I understand. And if that happens, Russia reserves the right to reconsider the terms. Fair enough. And Burkina Faso reserves the right to do the same if Russia violates the spirit of genuine partnership. They shook hands. And in that moment, both men understood they'd just established something unusual. A partnership based not on subordination, but on mutual acknowledgement that neither could control the other, and both were willing to work within that limitation. The agreement was announced 3 days later. Not in a grand Kremlin ceremony with the usual propaganda fanfare. But in a joint press conference that was notably different from typical Russia-Africa partnerships. Traoré and Putin stood side by side, not with Putin positioned dominantly as usual, but as equals. The contrast with previous Russian-African announcements was striking. When Putin spoke, he didn't use the paternal language typically employed with African leaders. Russia and Burkina Faso have established a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine sovereignty. We will provide military equipment and training. We will invest in agricultural and infrastructure development. And we will do so without political conditions or interference in Burkina Faso's domestic affairs. Traoré's statement was equally pointed. This partnership demonstrates that African nations can work with major powers without surrendering independence. Russia has agreed to terms that respect our sovereignty completely. We hope this becomes a model for how all international partnerships are structured. Western intelligence agencies noticed immediately. This wasn't the standard Russian playbook. Something had changed. Within 48 hours, the partnership triggered exactly what Putin had predicted, demands from other African nations for similar terms. Mali's transitional government requested a meeting with Russian officials. Niger sent diplomatic feelers. Chad began reassessing its foreign partnerships. But most African leaders didn't follow through. Because Traoré was right about something Putin had suspected, most preferred the easier path of traditional client relationships where someone else made the difficult decisions and provided guaranteed support, even at the cost of sovereignty. 6 months into the partnership, the results were mixed but revealing. Russian military equipment arrived as promised. Modern weapons systems, training programs, intelligence sharing. But true to the agreement, no Russian bases. No permanent military presence. No demands for UN voting alignment. The equipment came with genuine technology transfer, Russian engineers training Burkinabe technicians to maintain and eventually produce components locally. It was unprecedented. Russian economic investment followed a similar pattern. Agriculture projects that actually benefited local farmers. Infrastructure built by joint ventures employing and training local workers. Mining contracts negotiated at fair market rates with transparency requirements. Western analysts were confused. This wasn't how Russia operated in Africa. Where were the exploitative contracts? The political leverage? The slow creep toward dependence? The answer was that Traoré had structured the relationship to prevent exactly that. Every agreement included sunset clauses requiring renewal. Every project had clear metrics and local oversight. Every partnership maintained Burkina Faso's ability to walk away without penalty. It was partnership designed with exit strategies built in. And it was working. But the real test came 9 months after the Moscow meeting. Russia initiated a UN Security Council resolution condemning Western sanctions and calling for restructuring of international financial institutions. The kind of resolution Russia typically expected its African partners to support automatically. Traoré's government voted against it. The Russian ambassador to the UN immediately requested explanation. Burkina Faso's response was delivered through diplomatic channels, then made public: "We appreciate Russia's partnership. But we disagree with this resolution's framing and implications. Our partnership agreement specifically stated Burkina Faso maintains complete foreign policy independence. We are exercising that independence." Moscow's reaction was closely watched. Would Russia retaliate? Reduce support? Apply pressure? Putin's response surprised everyone. He issued a brief statement: "Burkina Faso has exercised its sovereign right to vote according to its national interest. Russia respects that, even when we disagree with the decision." This is what genuine partnership means. Western diplomats were stunned. Russia was actually honoring its commitment to non-interference. The partnership Traoré had negotiated was holding even under stress. But the incident triggered a broader realization in Moscow. If Russia was going to maintain influence in Africa without traditional leverage, it would need to actually deliver superior results. It would need to prove that partnership with Russia produced better outcomes than partnerships with other powers. The Kremlin convened a review of its entire Africa strategy. Putin attended personally, which indicated how seriously he took the issue. The Burkina Faso model is creating pressure across the continent, Foreign Minister Lavrov reported. Other nations are demanding similar terms. If we agree, we lose traditional leverage. If we refuse, we lose ground to competitors offering better deals. Putin was quiet for a moment. Then, "We've been approaching this wrong. We've been competing with the West by offering the opposite of what they offer. No democracy requirements, no human rights conditions, no governance interference. But we're still operating on the same fundamental assumption, that African nations exist to serve great power interests." Captain Traoré made me realize something in that first meeting. He said we treat African nations as pawns. And he's right. We do. We all do. The West, Russia, China, we're all playing the same game with different marketing. "What are you suggesting?" his defense minister asked. "I'm suggesting we actually try what we agreed to with Burkina Faso. Genuine partnership. Not as a tactical concession to one difficult leader. But as actual strategy. Because if we don't, Traoré's model spreads, and we end up competing on who can offer the most genuine respect. And in that competition, we're starting from behind. That's a complete reversal of our approach," Lavrov said. "It's an evolution. We've proven we can offer partnership without Western-style conditions. Now we prove we can offer it without Russian-style control. The nation that figures out how to be a genuine partner to Africa, not a patron, not a neo-colonial power, but an actual partner, that nation wins long-term influence." The new approach was implemented gradually. Russian partnerships across Africa began shifting. Not everywhere, Putin wasn't naive enough to abandon leverage completely. But in key relationships, terms improved. Transparency increased. Technology transfer became standard. Exit clauses were normalized. And something unexpected happened. Russian influence in Africa stabilized and in some areas grew. Not through control, but through demonstrated value. Countries that had been skeptical of Russian intentions began taking second looks. Leaders who had reflexively aligned with Western powers started diversifying. The model Traoré had forced Russia to accept was actually working better than the old model of dependence and leverage. Meanwhile, Burkina Faso became a case study. Development indicators improved. Security situation stabilized. Economic growth accelerated. All while maintaining genuine independence. Traoré's government worked with Russia where interests aligned. Disagreed publicly when they didn't. Maintained relationships with China, Turkey, and even cautiously with Western nations. They were proving it was possible to be genuinely non-aligned in a world that insisted every nation had to choose sides. 18 months after the Moscow meeting, Putin invited Traoré back. Not for negotiation this time. But for something different. They met in the same Kremlin office. But the atmosphere was completely different. "Captain Traoré, I wanted to thank you." Traoré looked surprised. "For what?" "For making me rethink Russia's entire approach to international partnerships. When you came here the first time, I thought you were naive. Idealistic in ways that reality would crush. But you were right, and I was wrong." "About what specifically?" "About sovereignty. About partnership. I've spent decades believing that international relations are fundamentally about power, who has it, how it's used, how it's maintained. And that's true to a degree. But you showed me something I'd forgotten. That respect is also a form of power. That being seen as a genuine partner creates influence that control never can." "I'm not sure I deserve credit for that realization," Traoré said. "You do. Because you were willing to walk away from everything Russia was offering rather than compromise your principles. That's rare. And it made me question why we structure partnerships to require that compromise." Putin stood, walking to his window again. Russia has spent years complaining about Western hegemony. About American unilateralism. About being treated as a threat rather than a partner. But we've been doing exactly the same thing to smaller nations. Demanding alignment. Expecting deference. Treating sovereignty as negotiable. You've changed that approach? We're trying. It's not complete. We still have strategic interests we'll protect. But we're learning that protecting interests doesn't require controlling partners. That lesson came from you." Traoré nodded slowly. "What happens now?" "Now we build on what we've started. Russia and Burkina Faso continue partnership as equals. We demonstrate that this model works. And hopefully, other powers notice and adapt." They talked for another hour. About implementation challenges. About resistance from hardliners in both governments. About the difficulty of maintaining principles under pressure. When Traoré prepared to leave, Putin walked him to the door personally. "One more thing, Captain. You said something in our first meeting that stayed with me. You said you wanted what I take for granted. The ability to make decisions based solely on national interest without external pressure. I remember. I realized something after you left. I don't actually take that for granted. Russia fights constantly to maintain that independence. Against Western pressure. Against economic leverage. Against international isolation. It's a struggle, even for a nuclear power with Security Council veto. So what's your point?" "My point is that sovereignty isn't something you achieve and then maintain passively. It's something you defend actively, every day, against everyone who wants to limit it. You understand that. And that understanding is why you'll probably succeed where others have failed." They shook hands. And both men recognized they'd formed something unusual in international relations, genuine mutual respect between unequal powers. Years later, when asked about the Putin meetings, Traoré always gave the same answer. People expected me to either completely reject Russia or become a Russian client. But neither made sense. Russia had things we needed. We had things Russia wanted. The question was whether we could structure a relationship that benefited both without requiring either side to surrender independence. Putin is a strategist. He understands power. And he understood that trying to control Burkina Faso would ultimately fail. Not because we're strong enough to resist indefinitely, but because we were willing to fail rather than accept control. And once he understood that, he made a strategic choice: adapt or lose influence entirely. That first meeting wasn't easy. He's used to African leaders who come seeking favor, who accept terms without question. I came offering partnership only if it respected sovereignty. That was new for him. Uncomfortable. But he's intelligent enough to recognize when an approach isn't working and pragmatic enough to try something different. The partnership we built isn't perfect. We still disagree on things. Russia still pursues Russian interests. But we've proven that major powers and small nations can work together without the small nation becoming subordinate. That matters. Because once you prove something is possible, it becomes harder for others to claim it's not. Putin tried to lead. I refused to follow. But we found we could walk beside each other. And that turned out to be more valuable than either of us expected.